The wind in Redemption Gulch had a voice. It wasn't the gentle whisper that rustled through aspen leaves in greener lands. It was a low, mournful howl that scraped its way down the jagged peaks of the Dragoon Mountains and swept across the valley with the persistence of a forgotten ghost. It carried the red dust of the high desert, a fine grit that settled in the lines around a man's eyes, coated the tongues of thirsty mules, and painted the decaying clapboard buildings in a perpetual state of dying. The town itself was little more than a scar on the landscape, a handful of structures huddled together as if for warmth against the vast, unforgiving emptiness. There was a saloon with bat-wing doors that slapped endlessly in the breeze, a general store whose windows were clouded with grime, a blacksmith's forge that rang with a lonely, rhythmic clang, and a church whose steeple leaned as if in prayer for its own salvation. This was a place people passed through on their way to somewhere better, or a place they came to when there was nowhere left to run. On the very edge of this desolation, where the valley floor began its slow, rocky climb into the foothills, stood a small, weathered cabin. It was the last outpost of civilization before the wilderness took over completely. Here lived Claire Anderson, a widow whose existence was as quiet and solitary as the landscape that surrounded her. Her world was circumscribed by a sagging split-rail fence that enclosed her small plot of land, a world that consisted of a sturdy log cabin, a small but resilient vegetable patch, a chicken coop, and a barn that stood a little ways off, its timber darkened by weather and memory. Claire was a woman carved from the same hard material as the land itself. She was not yet 30. But the unforgiving sun and the weight of her solitude had etched faint lines at the corners of her pale blue eyes. Her hands, though slender, were calloused from chopping wood, pulling weeds, and wringing the necks of chickens. She moved with a deliberate, economical grace, wasting no motion, speaking no unnecessary words. Her days were a litany of chores, a rhythm that kept the silence at bay. She collected eggs from her small flock of hens. She mended her worn dresses with neat, precise stitches. She hoed the hard-packed earth of her garden, coaxing forth stubborn potatoes and resilient squash. She was self-sufficient, a fact that was both her pride and her curse. The people in Redemption Gulch left her alone, but it was not a respectful solitude. It was the shunning of a leper. 2 years prior, her husband, Elias, had died. He had been a hard man with a thirst for whiskey and a temper like a flash flood. One night, the barn had gone up in flames, a roaring inferno that lit the valley like a hellish dawn. When the townsfolk arrived, it was too late. They found what was left of Elias inside, and they found Claire standing by the cabin, her face illuminated by the blaze, her expression unreadable. No one could prove anything. The fire could have been an accident. Elias was known to drink heavily in the barn, a lit lantern his only companion. But suspicion was a weed that grew readily in the barren soil of Redemption Gulch. Whispers followed Claire like her own shadow. They said she had a coldness in her, that she'd never shed a tear for her husband. They said Elias had been looking to sell the farm, to drag her off to some new mining camp, and that maybe she hadn't wanted to go. Mrs. Gable, the portly wife of the general store owner, was the most vocal. "The devil looks after his own," she'd mutter to customers, her eyes flicking towards the lonely cabin on the hill. That fire was too convenient, far too convenient. So, Claire became an island. When she had to ride into town for flour or salt, she felt their eyes on her back. The townsfolk would fall silent as she passed, conversations resuming in hushed tones only after she was out of earshot. They made a space around her, a bubble of cold judgment she had to walk through. In response, she built her walls higher. She stopped trying to meet their gazes, focusing instead on the dusty boardwalk beneath her feet. She never spoke to the men who loitered outside the saloon, their stares a mixture of crude curiosity and fear. She did her business with Mr. Gable quickly, her voice a low murmur, and fled back to the quiet of her valley. Her cabin was her fortress, as dusk began to bleed across the sky, casting long, skeletal shadows from the mountains. She would secure her home with a ritualistic precision. The chickens were locked in their coop. The heavy wooden bar was dropped across the cabin door, and the shutters were latched over the two small windows. Inside, with a fire crackling in the stone hearth, the world was reduced to the four walls of her home. The howling of the wind was her only companion, the dance of the flames her only entertainment. She had learned to live with the silence, to prefer it even. It was a clean sort of loneliness, untainted by the poison of whispers and accusing eyes. Men, she had decided, were a complication she could no longer afford. Elias had taught her that lesson with his heavy hands and sour breath. The town had reinforced it with their cruel ostracism. Her heart, she believed, was a barren piece of ground where nothing would ever grow again. The first snows of winter arrived early that year, a fine dusting of white that clung to the high peaks. Then, one afternoon in late November, the sky turned the color of a fresh bruise. The air grew still and heavy, pregnant with a coming violence. Claire knew the signs. She worked quickly, her breath pluming in the frigid air, securing everything that could be torn loose by a gale. She gave the chickens extra feed and reinforced the latch on their coop door. She carried in enough firewood to last for days, stacking it neatly by the hearth. By the time the first flakes began to drift down, thick and wet, the world had shrunk to a gray twilight. The wind began to rise, not with its usual mournful howl, but with a sharp, vicious shriek. The snow came faster, a blinding, swirling curtain of white that erased the mountains, the valley, and finally, the fence just yards from her cabin. Claire stood for a moment at her window, watching the storm's fury. It was a wild, untamable thing, a reflection of the chaos she kept so carefully locked out of her life. She felt a strange kinship with it, satisfied that she had done all she could. She barred the door, stoked the fire, and settled into her solitude for the long night ahead. Hours later, she was awakened by a sound that was not the wind. It was a frantic, desperate banging, muffled by the storm, coming from the direction of the chicken coop. Her first thought was a wolf or a coyote, driven mad by hunger. Her hens were her livelihood. The eggs they provided a vital part of her survival. Cursing the storm and the creature that dared to trespass, she pulled on her heavy coat, grabbed the loaded shotgun she kept by the door, and took a deep breath. Unbarring the door was a struggle against the wind, which tore at it like an angry beast. Stepping outside, she was hit by a wall of ice and snow. The cold was a physical blow. Stealing her breath, she could barely see a few feet in front of her, the world a maelstrom of white. She fought her way towards the coop, her head down, the shotgun held tight against her chest. The banging had stopped. She reached the small structure, relief washing over her when she saw the latch was still secure. The hens were rustling nervously inside, but they were safe. Confused, she turned to head back to the cabin, and that's when she saw it. A dark shape, a slump of black against the driven snow, lying near the fence line. It was almost completely covered, a new drift forming over it even as she watched. It was no animal. It was a man. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Every instinct screamed at her to turn back, to run to the safety of her cabin and bar the door. This was trouble. This was the world of men and their violence, a world she had turned her back on, now lying collapsed on her doorstep. He was probably dead already, frozen solid. Leaving him would be the sensible thing to do, the safe thing. No one would ever know. But she couldn't move. She stood frozen, the snow lashing at her face, her mind a war of reason against something older, something she thought had died in her long ago. Compassion. She took a hesitant step forward, then another, the shotgun now feeling heavy and useless in her hands. She reached him and brushed the snow from his back. He was large, dressed in a heavy, dark coat. She saw the source of the noise that had woken her. His horse, a big roan, stood huddled against the far side of the barn, its head low, shivering. The man must have been trying to reach the shelter of the barn when he fell. She knelt, her gloved hands finding his neck, searching for a pulse. It was there, faint and thready, but it was there. He was alive. She saw the blood then, a dark, ugly stain spreading from his right shoulder, melting the snow it touched. "Damn you," she whispered to the wind, to the unconscious man, to God. "Damn you for this." Reason lost the battle. She couldn't leave him here to die. Whatever he was, whatever he had done to get that wound, he was a human life, and she was its only witness. Gritting her teeth against the cold and the sheer folly of what she was about to do, she leaned the shotgun against the fence. She hooked her arms under his, trying to lift him. He was a dead weight, heavy with muscle and soaked clothing. She strained, her boots slipping in the snow, her back screaming in protest. Inch by agonizing inch, she dragged him away from the fence, towards the dark outline of the barn. It was the longest journey of her life. The wind fought her every step, trying to tear him from her grasp, trying to push her back into the oblivion of the storm. Finally, she reached the barn door. With the numb fingers, she managed to heave it open and pull him inside, collapsing next to him in the relative quiet. The air in the barn was cold, but still, it smelled of hay, dust, and her lone milk cow, Bessie, who looked at them with wide, placid eyes. For a long moment, Claire could do nothing but gasp for breath, her lungs burning. She couldn't bring him into the house. That was a line she would not cross. The barn was shelter enough. With renewed determination, she dragged him over to an empty stall filled with clean straw and old blankets. She got him onto the makeshift bed, his head lolling to one side, in the dim light filtering through the cracks in the walls. She could see his face for the first time. It was a hard face, all sharp angles and rough-hewn planes, shadowed with several days' worth of dark stubble. A long scar cut a white line through his left eyebrow. Even in unconsciousness, he looked dangerous. She fetched a lantern from the house, along with a bucket of hot water, clean rags, her sewing kit, and a bottle of whiskey. She worked with a grim focus, cutting away the bloody, frozen fabric of his coat and shirt. The wound was raw and brutal, a ragged hole where a bullet had torn through flesh and muscle. It was inflamed and angry-looking. She cleaned it as best she could, her touch surprisingly gentle. The man groaned, his body tensing, but he didn't wake. She poured a generous amount of whiskey directly into the wound. He arched his back with a guttural cry of pain that echoed in the quiet barn, his eyes flying open for a second before rolling back into his head. With a needle and thick thread sterilized in the lantern's flame, she began to stitch the torn flesh together. Her hands did not tremble. She was just a woman tending to a wound. That was all. She refused to think about who he was, or what would happen when he woke, when she was finished. She bandaged it tightly with strips of a clean sheet and covered him with every spare blanket she owned. His breathing was shallow, his skin clammy and pale. A fever was setting in. There was nothing more she could do but wait. He surfaced from his delirium 2 days later. The storm had passed, leaving the world buried in a pristine, silent blanket of white. Claire was in the stall, changing his bandage. When his eyes opened and focused on her, they were the color of a winter sky, a startling, clear gray, and they were sharp with an unnerving intelligence, pain, confusion, and then a deep, ingrained suspicion flickered within them. He tried to sit up, a sharp hiss of pain escaping his lips. "Stay still," Claire said, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. "You'll tear the stitches." He ignored her, pushing himself up with his good arm, his gaze darting around the barn, assessing his surroundings, assessing her. "Where am I?" he rasped, his voice rough from disuse. "My barn," she replied, not offering her name. She stood up, putting a safe distance between them. "You were freezing to death by my fence." He looked down at his bandaged shoulder, then back at her. His eyes held a question, but he didn't ask it. He was a man accustomed to violence, and perhaps to the unexpected kindness that sometimes followed it. He just nodded slowly. Claire picked up the empty bowl that had held the broth she'd managed to force between his lips while he was unconscious. She turned to leave. "Wait," he called out. She paused at the stall door, her back to him. "Thank you," he said, the words sounding foreign on his tongue. Claire said nothing. She walked out of the stall and started for the barn door. Before she left, she turned, her face a hard mask. "Don't you even think about coming inside the house," she warned, her voice low and firm. "The barn is where you'll stay. I'll bring you food and water. When you're strong enough, you'll leave. I don't want trouble." He watched her go, his gray eyes unreadable, and then sank back into the straw, the fever and pain pulling him back under. Over the next week, a strange, silent routine developed between them. 3 times a day, Claire would cross the snow-covered ground from her cabin to the barn. She would leave a bowl of stew or broth and a tin cup of water just inside the stall, collect the empty dishes from the last meal, and leave without a word. She tended to his wound with the same detached efficiency, cleaning and rebandaging it every morning. He never complained, just endured her touch with a stoic silence, his eyes following her every move. His strength returned with a startling speed. Soon, he was sitting up, then walking stiffly around the confines of the barn. He told her his name was Jake, and nothing more. He never asked hers. He was a quiet presence, watchful and still. But the barn, once a part of her solitary world, now felt occupied, charged with an energy that was distinctly male and vaguely threatening. The day he was strong enough to leave, he didn't. Claire awoke one morning to the rhythmic thump, thwack of an axe splitting wood. She looked out her window and saw him by the woodpile. He had found her axe, and despite his injured shoulder, he was methodically working his way through her log pile, splitting rounds with an economy of motion that spoke of long practice. He had shrugged on his torn coat against the cold, and his breath smoked in the crisp air. By midday, he had chopped more wood than she could in a week. The next day, he shoveled a clear path from her cabin door to the barn and another to the chicken coop. He found the broken slats in her fence, the ones she hadn't had the strength or materials to fix, and repaired them using scrap lumber he found in the barn. He moved with a quiet purpose, never asking permission, simply seeing what needed to be done and doing it. He was paying his debt. His continued presence did not go unnoticed. Sheriff Brody, a barrel-chested man whose face seemed permanently set in a weary frown, rode out a few days later. He didn't dismount, just sat his horse by the fence, watching Jake, who had stopped his work to watch him back. "Claire," the sheriff called out. Claire came to her cabin door, wiping her hands on her apron. She did not invite him in. "Sheriff," she acknowledged, her voice tight. "I heard you had company," Brody said, his eyes flicking from her to Jake and back again. "Town's talking. They're nervous." "He was injured," Claire said, offering no more. "He looks able enough now. You don't know who he is." "Claire, a man who gets himself shot and left for dead in a blizzard is usually running from something bad or running towards something worse. You're inviting trouble you can't handle. Send him on his way." "I will," she lied, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. The sheriff stared at her for a long moment, his expression a mixture of duty and a flicker of what might have been genuine concern. He shook his head slowly, clucked to his horse, and rode away, leaving a heavy silence in his wake. The pressure mounted. When Claire rode into town, the whispers were louder, the stares harder. Misses. Gable looked straight through her, refusing to acknowledge her presence until every other customer in the store had been served. Claire felt their judgment like a physical blow. They thought she was a fool, or worse, that she was willingly harboring a criminal, confirming all their dark suspicions about her character. Every rational part of her mind screamed that the sheriff was right. She had to tell Jake to leave. He was healed. His debt was paid, but the words wouldn't come. She was terrified of him, of his past, of the trouble he represented. But she was also terrified of the silence that would return when he was gone. She found herself watching him from her kitchen window. She watched the way he moved, with a coiled, predatory grace that was both intimidating and strangely compelling. She watched the powerful flex of his back as he worked. She saw him one afternoon by the fence, calming her nervous horse with a soft murmur and a steady hand, a gentleness that seemed at odds with the harsh lines of his face. And then there were his eyes. Sometimes, when she brought his food, he would be waiting, and their gazes would lock for a fleeting second. He looked at her not with lust or pity, but with an unnerving directness, a stark, searching appraisal that seemed to peel back the layers of her defenses. In the gray depths of his eyes, she saw a profound loneliness, a weariness that went bone deep. It was a loneliness that she recognized, for it was a mirror of her own, and in that shared, unspoken understanding, a strange and terrifying warmth began to bloom in the frozen center of her chest. It was a feeling she hadn't known for years, a flicker of life in a place she had long considered dead. She was torn between her fear of the dangerous man in her barn and this new, unwelcome feeling he stirred within her. The walls she had so carefully built were being tested, not by force, but by a quiet presence and a pair of lonely eyes, and she was terrified they were about to come tumbling down. The silence between them began to change. It was no longer the stark, empty silence of two strangers coexisting in a state of mutual suspicion, but a silence that was becoming heavy with unspoken things. Jake had healed. The wound in his shoulder was now a puckered, angry scar, a permanent mark of the violence that had delivered him to her doorstep. By all rights, he should have left. His debt was paid in mountains of split firewood and a mended fence that now stood straight and true against the wind. Yet, he remained. The conversation started in fragments, clipped and cautious, exchanged over the threshold of the barn door. One evening, as she handed him a steaming bowl of rabbit stew, he didn't retreat immediately into the shadows. He stood there, the lantern light carving deep hollows into his face. "This is the best food I've had in a long time," he said, his voice a low rumble. Claire just nodded, her hand tight on the door frame. "Must be hard," he continued, looking out at the vast, snow-covered darkness. Being out here alone, it was not a question, but a statement of fact from a man who knew loneliness as intimately as he knew the cold steel of a gun. "I manage," she said, her voice tight. "Doesn't mean it ain't hard," he countered gently. Another day, he looked at her hands, red and chapped from hauling buckets of water from the well. "I can do that," he said, before she could protest. He took the heavy wooden buckets and strode towards the well, his limp barely perceptible now. He was slowly, methodically, breaking down her defenses by shouldering her burdens. The stories of his past came out in the same piecemeal way, offered up like rare, carefully chosen currency. He told her about the orphanage in St. Louis, a place run by stern-faced women in gray dresses, where hunger was a constant companion and affection was a foreign language. He spoke of running away at 14, of working on the railroads, of the brutal, soul-crushing labor that had hardened his body and taught him that the world gave nothing for free. "And the war?" she asked one afternoon, her voice barely a whisper, gesturing towards the scar above his eye. He was silent for a long moment, his gaze distant. "There are many wars," he said finally. "Not all of them are fought by men in uniform. I learned to use a gun because it paid better than a shovel. A man does what he must to see the next sunrise. Sometimes the sun comes up on things you wish you could forget." He never glorified it. He spoke of the life of a hired gun, riding for cattle barons in Texas, guarding gold shipments in the Black Hills, with a profound weariness. The words tinged with the bitter taste of regret. He was a man haunted not by the men he might have killed, but by the man he had been forced to become in order to survive. His raw, unvarnished honesty was a key turning a lock deep inside her. His confessions did not frighten her as she expected they would. Instead, they resonated with the dark. secret truths of her own life. One crisp, cold afternoon, as they stood near the skeletal, blackened timbers that marked the site of the old barn fire, he looked at the ruins and then at her. "Must have been a terrible night," he said quietly. And the dam inside Claire finally broke. The story she had held captive for 2 years came pouring out, a torrent of whispered, painful words. She told him about Elias, not the grievingly departed husband the town pretended to remember, but the real man, the man whose moods were dictated by the level of whiskey in his bottle, whose laughter could curdle into a snarl in a heartbeat. She spoke of the night spent cowering in the cabin, listening to him rage in the barn, the fear, a cold knot in her stomach. She spoke of his casual cruelty, the back of his hand, the way he looked at her as if she were just another one of his possessions. "The fire," she began, her voice trembling, her gaze fixed on the charred wood. "It was an accident. He was drunk. He was always drunk in the end. He knocked over the lantern. I heard him yelling." Her breath hitched, a dry, ragged sob. "I ran to the door. I saw the flames, and I just stood there. I stood there and I watched it burn. I didn't scream for help until the roof was about to collapse. I didn't go in. I let him die." She finally looked at Jake, her eyes swimming with unshed tears, expecting to see disgust, condemnation, the same judgment she saw in the eyes of the townsfolk, but there was none. His face was etched with a deep, sorrowful understanding. He had spoken of the things a man must do to survive. He understood, better than anyone, the things a woman might not do. For the very same reason, he didn't say a word. He just held her gaze, and in the quiet space between them, she felt not absolution, but something far more precious, acceptance. For the first time in 2 years, she was not alone with her secret. As they drew closer emotionally, the winter tightened its grip, determined to break them physically. A new blizzard descended upon the valley, a relentless 3-day siege of wind and snow that buried the cabin up to its windowsills. The world beyond her small homestead ceased to exist. The cold was a palpable entity, seeping through the cracks in the logs, turning the water in the bucket to ice overnight. The firewood Jake had chopped, which had seemed like an inexhaustible supply, began to dwindle at an alarming rate. Her stores of flour and salted meat were running low. Survival became a conscious, daily effort. The storm forced a change in their arrangement. It was too cold for him to stay in the drafty barn. Claire couldn't bring herself to invite him into the cabin. Not yet, but she allowed him to take shelter in the small tack room attached to the barn, where she kept an old potbelly stove. It was a small concession, but a significant one. They were trapped, isolated from the world, their survival intertwined. The shared hardship stripped away the last of their formalities, forging a bond of primal necessity between them. One evening, at the height of the blizzard, Jake fought his way through the chest-deep snow to check on the cow and the chickens. On his way back, he paused outside her window. The storm was a raging white chaos around him, the wind tearing at his clothes, but inside the cabin, he saw a scene of impossible peace. Claire was sitting in a rocking chair by the hearth, the firelight casting a warm, golden glow around her. She was mending one of his shirts, her head bent to her task, the needle moving with a steady, rhythmic grace. The light caught the soft curve of her neck and the stray strands of honey-blonde hair that had escaped her bun. To Jake, a man who had known nothing but cold boarding houses, rough-hewn bunkhouses, and the hard ground of open campfires, the sight of her was like a glimpse into another world. It was a world of warmth, of peace, of home. It was everything he had never had, everything he never thought to want until this very moment. He was the outcast, the specter in the storm, looking in on a life he could never be a part of. He felt a pang of longing so sharp and so deep it was a physical ache in his chest. As if she could feel his eyes on her, Claire looked up. She saw him standing there, a dark, solitary figure framed against the swirling maelstrom of snow. She saw the ice in his beard, the weariness in his posture, and the stark, unutterable loneliness on his face. In that instant, he was not the dangerous gunslinger, not the town's pariah, but just a man, cold and alone in the dark. And her heart, which had been so carefully guarded for so long, broke wide open. Without a second thought, she put down her sewing, walked to the door, and lifted the heavy bar. She pulled it open just enough for him to slip through, the wind immediately trying to force its way inside. "Get in," she said, her voice almost lost in the howl of the storm. He hesitated for a second, his gray eyes wide with surprise. Then he stepped over the threshold, bringing a swirl of snow and a gust of frigid air in with him. He stood awkwardly just inside the door, stamping the snow from his boots, not daring to move further into the room. The warmth was a shock to his system. He looked around the small, clean cabin, at the fire, the simple wooden furniture, the neatly patched quilt on the bed in the corner. It was the first time he had been inside. Claire closed and barred the door, shutting out the storm. The sudden quiet was deafening. "You can't stay in the tack room in this," she said, avoiding his gaze. "You'll freeze." She pointed to a space on the floor by the hearth, where a spare blanket lay folded. "You can sleep there." Then she looked at him, her blue eyes filled with a fierce, warning vulnerability. "But only sit there, no further." It was a boundary line drawn in the very air between them, a conditional surrender. He was in her sanctuary, but he was not yet welcome in her life. "I understand," he said, his voice thick with an emotion she couldn't name. He moved to the spot she had indicated and sat on the floor, his back against the wall, keeping a respectful distance. He was in her home, bathed in the warmth of her fire, and it felt more terrifying and more wonderful than any danger he had ever faced. The blizzard finally broke, leaving behind a world of breathtaking, silent beauty and treacherous, deep drifts. It took another day before the trail to town was even remotely passable. It was the blacksmith, a burly, grim-faced man named Thomas Miller, who made the journey out. He didn't come with friendly greetings. He rode his big draft horse as far as the fence and called for Claire, his face set like stone. "The town sent me," he said, his voice flat and hard. When she came to the door, Jake stood behind her, in the shadows of the cabin. "They know he's in there with you. Claire, they saw the smoke from the second chimney." "He would have frozen," Claire said, her own voice defensive. "That ain't their concern," Miller grunted. "They won't have it. A woman like you, alone, with a man of his reputation. It ain't right. They're saying you have to send him on his way. Now." He leaned forward in his saddle, his eyes cold. "This is your only warning. You get rid of him, or we will." The threat was unmistakable, hanging in the frigid air between them like a hangman's noose. Thomas Miller was not a cruel man by nature, but he was a mouthpiece for the town's fear, and fear could make any man cruel. He turned his horse and rode away, leaving Claire shivering, though not from the cold. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. The town was no longer just whispering. They were threatening. They would come for him. They would come for her. She looked at Jake, who had heard every word. His face was a stoic mask, but his eyes were like chips of ice. He had brought this down on her, this new and terrible danger. The old fear, the instinct for self-preservation, surged through her. She should tell him to go. It was the only sane choice. But then she looked, truly looked, at him. Over the past weeks, she had seen the man behind the reputation. She had seen the quiet competence in his hands, the weary regret in his stories, the deep well of loneliness in his soul. He was dangerous. Yes, the world had made him so. But when he looked at her, she saw no threat. She saw a desperate, unspoken plea for trust, for a second chance, for a place to rest. He was a man who had been cast out his entire life, and she, another outcast, was on the verge of doing it to him again. The thought of sending him away, back out into the cold, unforgiving world that had already broken him in so many ways, was suddenly unbearable. In that moment, she knew. She was no longer just sheltering him. She was protecting him, and the feeling that bloomed in her heart was more terrifying than any threat the town could make. The tension in the cabin over the next few nights was thick enough to cut with a knife. They were living on a precipice, waiting for the other shoe to drop. The shared danger bound them closer, creating an intimacy that was both exhilarating and frightening. One night, the fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting flickering shadows on the walls. They sat in a comfortable silence, the unspoken emotions a living presence in the room. "You shouldn't have done it," he said suddenly, his voice a low rasp in the quiet. "Done what?" she asked. "Let me in. Kept me here. Now you're in trouble on my account. I make my own choices," she replied, her voice stronger than she felt. He looked at her then, his gaze so intense it felt like a physical touch. "Why?" he asked. "Why me?" "Because," she started, then stopped, unable to voice the truth. "Because you are the same as me, because you are lonely, because you make me feel something other than fear. Because I couldn't leave you in the snow." She finished lamely. He knew she was lying, or at least not telling the whole truth. He shifted, moving from his spot on the floor to kneel in front of her chair. He took her hand. His was large and calloused, but his touch was surprisingly gentle. "Claire," he said, speaking her name for the first time. It sounded like a prayer on his lips. The air crackled, charged with everything they had shared, their secrets, their fears, their solitude. He leaned forward slowly, his gray eyes searching hers, asking a silent question. She saw the raw vulnerability on his face, the longing that mirrored her own. Her breath caught in her throat, her heart hammered against her ribs. This was it. This was the moment she had been dreading and craving. He was inches from her lips when the panic hit, a tidal wave of fear and regret. The face of Elias, twisted in a drunken sneer. The cold, judging eyes of the townsfolk. The image of Thomas Miller and his ugly threat. This was a mistake, a terrible, ruinous mistake. With a strangled cry, she pushed against his chest. "I can't," she gasped, her voice trembling. "I can't. I'll regret this." The words struck him like a physical blow. The light in his eyes died, replaced by a familiar, shuttered darkness. He didn't get angry. He simply looked defeated. Rejection was a language he understood perfectly. He had been hearing it his whole life, without a word. He stood up. He looked at her one last time, his face an unreadable mask of hurt, then turned and walked to the door. He lifted the bar, opened it, and stepped out into the cold, moonlit night. He closed the door softly behind him, the click of the latch echoing in the sudden, crushing silence of the cabin. Claire sat frozen, her hand still tingling from where she had pushed him. The room, which had felt so full and warm just moments before, was now cavernously empty. The fire seemed to give off no heat. She scrambled to the window, her heart pounding with a terrible, sickening rhythm. She saw his dark figure trudging through the deep snow, not towards the barn, but away from the cabin, towards the dark, open mouth of the valley. He didn't look back. She watched until he was just a small speck in the vast, silver landscape, and then he was gone. The safety she had so desperately clung to had returned. The town would have no more reason to threaten her. The danger was gone, but as she stood there, staring out at the empty, snow-covered world, a profound, aching void opened up inside her. It was a loneliness far deeper and more painful than anything she had ever known before. She had just sent away the only person who had ever truly seen her, and she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that she had just made the biggest mistake of her life. The 3 days that followed Jake's departure were the longest of Claire's life. The silence he left behind was a tangible thing, a heavy, suffocating blanket that was infinitely more oppressive than the quiet solitude she had once cultivated. Before him, the silence had been a shield. Now, it was a tomb. The cabin felt cavernously empty, each creak of the floorboards a lonely echo in the void. Her daily chores, once a comforting rhythm that structured her existence, became hollow, meaningless motions. She collected eggs from hens that seemed to cluck with a listless air. She stoked a fire that gave warmth but no comfort. She looked out the window at the vast, indifferent expanse of white and saw only the fading tracks of the man she had sent away. She was consumed by a regret so sharp it felt like a physical illness. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw his face in that last moment, the flicker of hope extinguished, the familiar, shuttered look of a man who had expected nothing less than rejection. She had pushed him away not because she didn't want him, but because she was terrified of how much she did. She had chosen the cold, bitter safety of her prison over the terrifying, unknown possibility of freedom. She had mistaken fear for wisdom, and in doing so, had sentenced herself to a loneliness more profound than she had ever imagined. The town had made her an outcast, but she, with her own hands, had just ensured she would remain one forever. On the fourth morning, she awoke to a world that felt gray and pointless. She forced herself out of bed, her limbs heavy with a weariness that had nothing to do with lack of sleep. As she listlessly began to prepare her meager breakfast, a sound from outside made her freeze. It was the steady, rhythmic crunch of boots on snow, a sound she thought she would never hear again. Her heart leaped into her throat, a wild, frantic bird beating against the cage of her ribs. She rushed to the window, her hands trembling as she wiped away the condensation. There he was. He wasn't a speck in the distance. He was right there, leading his roan horse, which now bore two heavy-looking sacks slung over its back. He moved with the same weary purpose as always. His shoulders slumped slightly against the cold. He looked up, as if he knew she would be watching, and their eyes met across the snow-covered yard. He didn't smile, but he held her gaze, a silent question in his. Claire fumbled with the bar on the door, her fingers clumsy and numb. She pulled it open and stood on the threshold, the frigid morning air a shock against her skin. She didn't care. He stopped a few feet away, the horse snorting and shaking its head. "You came back," she whispered, the words a mixture of disbelief and prayer. He nodded, his gaze unwavering. "I wasn't leaving because you turned me away." "Claire," he said, his voice low and steady, a sound that seemed to calm the frantic beating of her heart. "I was leaving because I thought that's what you needed. But I couldn't go far. I just had to be sure you were safe." He had ridden to a different town, a trading post 2 days' journey to the north, avoiding Redemption Gulch entirely. He gestured to the sacks on his horse. "Flour," he said, "and salt pork, coffee, things you were running low on." He had spent what little money he had not on himself, but on her. The gesture was so simple, so profound. It shattered the last of her defenses. He hadn't returned to claim anything, or to punish her for her rejection. He had returned to provide, to protect. He had returned because he cared. Tears she hadn't shed for her husband, for the fire, or for her own miserable loneliness, now streamed freely down her face. She didn't try to hide them. He took a step forward, then another, until he was standing right in front of her. He raised a calloused, gentle hand and brushed a tear from her cheek with his thumb. "It's all right," he murmured. "It's all right." And she knew, with a certainty that resonated deep in her soul, that it would be. His return marked a new beginning. The invisible line between the cabin and the barn, between her life and his, dissolved. He moved his few belongings, a bedroll, a saddlebag, from the barn into the cabin without her having to ask. It felt natural, right. He took the spot on the floor by the hearth again, but this time it wasn't a boundary. It was a quiet, respectful presence. The cabin was no longer empty. It was full of the sound of his breathing in the night, the smell of his coffee in the morning, the steady, comforting weight of his existence. They fell into a new rhythm, a domestic partnership forged in the crucible of winter. Claire found herself letting go of the tight, anxious control she had maintained over her life. They began to cook together, standing side by side in the small kitchen space, She would peel potatoes while he chopped salted pork, their movements a quiet, efficient dance. He taught her how to make sourdough starter, a skill he'd learned in a mining camp, and the smell of fresh bread soon filled the small cabin, a scent of home she hadn't known in years. As the snows began to melt under the strengthening sun, their world expanded beyond the four walls of the cabin. They worked together in the garden, turning over the damp, rich soil. He showed her how to properly brace the tomato vines and how to dig deeper furrows for the potatoes. She, in turn, showed him which wild herbs that grew in the foothills were good for seasoning and which could be used for medicine. They worked in a comfortable silence, their hands in the same earth, nurturing the first green shoots of new life, a mirror of the fragile, tentative thing that was growing between them. One afternoon, when the hard work of the day was done, he looked at her horse, grazing peacefully in the small pasture. "He needs a good run," Jake said. "And so do you." Before she could protest, he had saddled both his roan and her gentle mare. He helped her mount, his hands firm and warm on her waist, a touch that sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the cool spring air. They rode out of the valley, leaving the cabin and its ghosts behind, climbing into the rolling foothills that were now carpeted in a sea of new green grass and dotted with the vibrant colors of Indian paintbrush and bluebonnets. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. The simple act of riding side by side, of sharing the vast, beautiful landscape, was a conversation in itself. He led her to a place he had discovered on one of his solitary explorations, a hidden creek that tumbled down from the high mountains over smooth, gray stones. It was a place of serene, untouched beauty. They dismounted and let the horses drink from the clear, cold water. They sat on a large, sun-warmed boulder, the sound of the babbling creek filling the air. The afternoon sun was warm on their faces. It was here, in this peaceful sanctuary, that they felt truly free from the prying eyes of the town, from the shadows of their pasts. It became their place. They returned to the creek often in the weeks that followed. They would ride out as the sun began its descent, painting the sky in fiery strokes of crimson and gold. The evening light would turn the waving grasslands into a gilded sea, and the clear, still pools of the creek would perfectly reflect the sky, the mountains, and the two figures sitting on the bank. They would watch the sunset in silence, a shared awe for the rugged beauty of the land that had been so cruel to them both. In those moments, watching the last rays of light fade from the sky, Claire felt a sense of peace she had never known. The jagged edges of her soul felt soothed. Her heart felt full. She would look at Jake, his hard profile softened by the twilight, and feel a wave of emotion so powerful it stole her breath. It wasn't just gratitude or affection. It was love, pure and undeniable, taking root in the broken ground of her heart. One evening, they stayed at the creek later than usual, mesmerized by the emergence of a brilliant canopy of stars in the clear, dark sky. They started back for the cabin in a comfortable, moonlit silence. They were halfway home when the weather turned with a sudden, violent caprice of the high country. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain, and dark clouds raced across the face of the moon, plunging the world into an inky blackness. The first drops were fat and cold, and within minutes, the heavens opened up in a torrential downpour. They spurred their horses on, but it was useless. By the time they reached the relative shelter of the cabin's porch, they were both completely soaked. The rain hammered on the shingled roof, a deafening, relentless drumbeat. Claire slid from her horse, her teeth chattering. Her simple cotton dress, now sodden, clung to her body like a second skin, outlining every curve, the thin fabric becoming almost transparent. She was suddenly acutely aware of her own vulnerability, of Jake's eyes on her in the dim light. She wrapped her arms around herself, as much to hide her body as to ward off the chill. Jake dismounted and moved to her side. He said nothing. He simply shrugged off his heavy wool coat, the fabric dark and slick with rain. and wrapped it around her shoulders. The coat was heavy and smelled of him, of leather, rain, and the clean scent of pine. The warmth that radiated from it was immediate and profound, sinking through her wet dress and into her very bones. She clutched the lapels, pulling it tighter around herself, burying her face for a second in the rough, comforting fabric. She looked up at him to thank him, but the words died in her throat. He was standing so close she could feel the heat coming off his body. His dark hair was plastered to his forehead, and rivulets of water traced paths down the hard planes of his face, dripping from his square jaw. His gray eyes, darker than she had ever seen them, were fixed on her with an intensity that burned through the cold and the dark. The air between them crackled with a tension that had nothing to do with the storm. It was the culmination of weeks of unspoken longing, of shared glances, of gentle touches, of two lonely souls finally finding their harbor. The storm that had been brewing inside them for so long finally broke. He lowered his head, and she raised hers, meeting him halfway. The kiss was not gentle. It was fierce, desperate, and hungry. It was the taste of rain and longing, of regret and redemption. It was a release of all the pent-up pain and fear, a raw, honest claiming. His hands came up to cup her face, his calloused thumbs stroking her wet cheeks, while her hands tangled in his wet hair, pulling him closer. It was a kiss that sealed their fate, a promise made without words under the shelter of a roof in a raging storm. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathless, their foreheads resting against each other. The rain still hammered down around them, but they were in the calm eye of their own private storm. "Claire," he rasped, his voice thick with emotion. She didn't answer with words. She simply took his hand, her small, cold fingers lacing through his large, warm ones. She turned and led him to the cabin door. This time, she didn't hesitate. She lifted the bar and pulled the door wide open, a clear, unambiguous invitation. She led him inside, into the warm, fire-lit heart of her home, and closed the door on the world. That night, they crossed the final threshold. It was not a collision of passion, but a slow, tender rediscovery. For Claire, it was the unlearning of years of pain, the realization that a man's touch could be gentle, patient, and giving. For Jake, it was an act of profound reverence, a worship of the woman who had saved him in more ways than one. In the quiet darkness of the cabin, with the storm still raging outside, two broken, lonely people found solace and a fragile, breathtaking wholeness in each other's arms. They found a place where their scars didn't matter, where their pasts could be laid to rest. They found home. Claire awoke the next morning to the soft light of dawn filtering through the window. For a moment, she lay in a state of blissful confusion, her body feeling warm, languid, and alive in a way it never had before. Then, the memory of the previous night rushed back, and with it, a cold wave of fear and shame. What had she done? She had given herself to a man she barely knew, a man with a violent past, a man the town wanted to hang. The old voices of doubt and societal judgment screamed in her head. This was a mistake, a reckless, unforgivable sin. She felt a blush of shame creep up her neck. She turned her head and saw Jake, awake, lying on his side, watching her. The look in his eyes held no trace of lust or triumph. It was filled with a quiet, tender adoration that made her heart ache. He reached out and gently brushed a strand of hair from her face. "Good morning," he said softly. Claire couldn't meet his gaze. She started, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't know if this was right." He didn't pull away. His expression didn't harden. He just looked at her with that same deep, unnerving understanding. "I will never touch you again if you don't want me to." "Claire," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "Last night, that was for you to decide. Every night from now on will be for you to decide. I'm not Elias. I won't ever be him." The shame and fear inside her began to recede. replaced by a wave of profound relief and gratitude. He was giving her what no one else ever had, a choice, control over her own body, her own heart. He took a deep breath, his gray eyes serious and unwavering. "I'm not a man with much to offer," he said. "I've got nothing but the clothes on my back and a past I'd rather forget. But what I do have, I want to give to you. My name, my protection, my life. Claire Anderson. Will you marry me?" The question hung in the quiet morning air of the cabin, more real and more solid than the simple wooden furniture or the stone of the hearth. "Will you marry me?" It was not a question Claire had ever expected to hear again, and certainly not one she expected to fill her with such a terrifying, soaring hope. For 2 years, she had been a widow, a ghost haunting the edges of a town that had condemned her. Jake's proposal was not just about a ring or a vow. It was an offer of a name, a partnership, a bulwark against the world. It was an offer to no longer be alone. "Yes," she whispered, the single word a profound act of defiance against her past and her fear. "Yes, Jake." The decision, once made, settled a new kind of peace between them, but they both knew that their private peace would mean a public war. The town of Redemption Gulch would not simply accept their union. It would have to be confronted. A few days later, they made a silent pact to do just that. They would ride into town together, not as a widow and her hired hand, but as a couple. It was a declaration. The moment their horses appeared on the town's dusty main street, a palpable change occurred. Conversations on the boardwalk ceased, freezing in mid-sentence. Men who had been leaning against porch posts slowly straightened up, their faces hardening. Windows, which had been empty moments before, now framed the curious, hostile faces of women. It was as if a cold front had rolled down from the mountains, preceding them. Claire held her head high, her knuckles white where she gripped the reins. She could feel the stairs like physical things, 100 tiny needles pricking her skin. Jake rode beside her, his face a granite mask, but she could see the tension in the set of his jaw, the way his hand rested, not quite touching. On the Colt holstered at his hip, he was a coiled spring, ready to react to the slightest threat against her. Their first stop was the general store. The bell above the door gave a cheerful, mocking jingle as they entered. The interior was dim and smelled of coffee beans, cured leather, and dust. Mr. Gable was behind the counter, a small man with spectacles perched on his nose. But it was his wife who stepped forward from the back, her arms crossed over her formidable bosom. Mrs. Gable's face was a thundercloud of righteous indignation. "We need flour and lard," Claire said, her voice commendably steady, though her heart was hammering. "Mrs." Gable's lips thinned into a razor-like line. She looked from Claire to Jake, her eyes lingering on him with a mixture of fear and contempt. "We don't serve your kind here," she said, her voice dripping with venom. "My kind?" Claire asked, a flush of anger rising in her cheeks. "Women who take up with killers and drifters." "Mrs." Gable spat, not even bothering to lower her voice. A few other customers in the store, a farmer and his wife, shuffled their feet and suddenly became very interested in a barrel of pickles. "You've made your bed, Claire Anderson. Now you can lie in it. Get out of my store." The humiliation was a slap in the face. Claire felt the blood drain from her head, leaving her dizzy. Before she could react, Jake took a single, menacing step forward. The air in the store seemed to crackle. "Mr." Gable shrank back behind the counter. "You'll sell her what she needs," Jake said, his voice a low, dangerous growl that was more threatening than any shout. "Jake, no," Claire whispered, grabbing his arm. "Let's go. It's not worth it." He stood his ground for another second, his gray eyes locked on Mrs. Gable, a silent promise of violence in their depths. Then, feeling Claire's desperate tug on his sleeve, he relented. He allowed her to pull him from the store, the mocking jingle of the bell following them out into the hostile sunlight. They returned to the cabin empty-handed. the silence on the ride home heavy and fraught. The town had drawn its battle line. That evening, as Claire went to lock the chickens in for the night, she saw it, scrawled across the weathered gray wood of her barn door in crude, white letters was a single, ugly word: witch. A cold dread, deeper than the humiliation in the store, washed over her. This was different. This was not just shunning. It was an accusation, an ancient and deadly one. It was the town branding her, marking her as something evil, something to be purged. She stared at the word, her vision blurring, feeling as if the brand had been seared directly onto her own skin. She thought of the whispers after Elias's death, the suspicion in their eyes. This was the culmination of all that festering hatred. She wrapped her arms around herself, a sudden, violent shiver racking her body. Jake found her there minutes later, standing frozen in the twilight. He saw the word, and a darkness crossed his face that Claire had never seen before. It was a cold, lethal fury that seemed to radiate from him, making the air around him feel thin and cold. "Who did this?" he asked, his voice deceptively calm. "I don't know," she whispered. "It could have been anyone." "I'm going into town," he said, turning on his heel. "No, Jake, don't!" she cried, running after him. "It will only make things worse. Please!" He stopped and looked at her, his face a terrible mask of rage. "They call you a witch. They refuse you food. What do you want me to do, Claire? Stand here and let them do it." "I want you to stay here with me," she pleaded, her voice breaking. "Fighting them won't help." He looked from her desperate, tear-streaked face to the hateful word on the barn. For a long moment, he was torn. Then, with a visible effort, he reined in his rage. He pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly as she sobbed against his chest. But Claire knew, as she clung to him, that the violence had not been averted. It had only been postponed. The next day, Jake announced he was riding into town for supplies. He said he would go to the trading post in the next county, but Claire saw the lie in his eyes. She saw the grim set of his jaw and knew he was going to Redemption Gulch. She begged him not to go, but his mind was made up. "I'm not looking for a fight," he promised, his voice gentle as he kissed her goodbye. "But I'm done running from them." He went straight to the saloon. It was the black heart of the town, the place where the whispers and hatred were brewed. The moment he pushed through the bat-wing doors, the low murmur of conversation died. He stood for a moment, letting his eyes adjust to the gloom, his gaze sweeping over the faces of the men at the bar and the tables. He was looking for someone. He found him at a back table, playing cards with a few other ranch hands. Caleb Thorne. He was a swaggering, loud-mouthed man who had been one of Elias's drinking partners, a man who had always looked at Claire with a possessive, sneering gaze. Jake had seen the way Thorne watched them when they rode through town. He had seen the malice in his eyes. Jake walked over to the table. "Thorne," he said, his voice quiet but carrying in the sudden silence. Thorne looked up, a smirk on his face. Well, look what the widow dragged in," he said, loud enough for the whole room to hear. A few of the men snickered. "Come for a drink. Killer? Or did your witch send you on an errand?" Jake ignored the taunt. "You're a coward," he said calmly. "Riding on a woman's barn in the middle of the night." Thorne's smirk vanished. He pushed his chair back and stood up, his hand dropping to the butt of his pistol. "You're making a big mistake, drifter. The mistake was yours," Jake said, his eyes like ice. "You're going to ride out to her place, and you're going to scrub that word off her barn. And then you're going to apologize." Thorne laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "I'll see you in hell first." He drew his gun. He was fast, but Jake was faster. He didn't go for his own gun. He moved with a speed that was shocking, closing the distance between them in a single step. He smashed Thorne's wrist against the edge of the table, sending the pistol clattering to the floor. A crack of bone echoed in the saloon. Thorne screamed, a high, thin sound of pain. Before anyone else could react, Jake hit him. It wasn't a wild brawl. It was a brutal, efficient, and methodical dismantling. He hit him with a cold, contained fury, a series of short, devastating blows to the face and body. When it was over, less than a minute after it began, Caleb Thorne was a bloody, unconscious heap on the floor. Jake stood over him, breathing heavily, his knuckles raw and bleeding. He looked around the silent, stunned room. "Anyone else?" he asked, his voice a low growl. No one moved. No one met his eye. He turned and walked out of the saloon, leaving a broken man and a room full of fear behind him. Caleb Thorne didn't die, but his jaw was broken. Along with several ribs and the wrist of his gun hand, he would be drinking his meals for a long time. The story of the fight spread through the valley like a brush fire, but it didn't earn Jake any respect. It only confirmed their worst fears. He wasn't just a drifter. He was a stone-cold killer, a man who could cripple another without breaking a sweat. The whispers turned into a torrent of vicious rumors. Jake wasn't just protecting the widow. He was bewitching her, using her for her land. Hadn't she gotten rid of her husband in a convenient fire? Now she had a new man, a hired gun to protect her ill-gotten gains. They were a pair, the witch and the warlock, a blight on the community. The town's fear and hatred coalesced, becoming a single, malevolent entity. Claire felt the change immediately. The shunning was now absolute. The pressure was suffocating. She felt like she was drowning. One evening, as they sat by the fire, the weight of it all became too much. "This isn't working, Jake," she said, her voice hollow. "Look what we've done. They hate us more than ever. I can't live like this." "Then let's leave," he said, his voice urgent. He came and knelt before her, taking her hands. "We can go. Claire, we can go anywhere. California, Oregon. We can find a place where nobody knows us, where we can start over. We don't need their forgiveness. We don't need them at all." She pulled her hands away, a terrible, aching conflict tearing her apart. "Leave?" she whispered. This is all I have. This land. It's just dirt. Claire." "No," she cried, jumping to her feet. "It's not just dirt. It's the only thing in my life that's ever been mine. Elias owned me. The town judges me. But this land, I bled for this land. I cried into this dirt. I built that garden with my own 2 hands after he was gone. It's the only thing I've ever fought for and won. I can't just walk away from it." "They're going to tear you apart if we stay," he argued, his voice rising with frustration and fear for her. "Can't you see that? It's not worth it." "It's all I'm worth," she sobbed. The argument ended there, leaving a painful, unresolved chasm between them. He wanted to save her by running. She felt she could only be saved by standing her ground. The attack came 2 nights later. Jake had gone out after dinner to check a line of snares he had set in the woods, hoping to catch a rabbit for the pot. The moon was a sliver in a cloudy sky, and an uneasy silence had settled over the valley. Claire was washing the dishes when she heard a noise outside. It wasn't the wind. It was the soft thud of a boot on her porch. Before she could even scream, the cabin door burst open, splintering off its hinges. 3 men, their faces hidden by crude burlap sacks with holes cut for eyes, stormed in. One of them was large and smelled of whiskey and stale sweat. He grabbed her, his hand clamping over her mouth, muffling her terrified cry. She fought, kicking and struggling, but he was too strong. Another man quickly and efficiently tied her wrists together with a rough piece of rope. They dragged her out of the cabin and threw her to the ground near the woodpile. She lay there, her heart hammering against her ribs, gasping for breath, the rough rope cutting into her skin. A 4th man joined them, carrying a can of lamp oil. "Burn it," the large man grunted, his voice a low, gravelly sound she didn't recognize. "Burn the whole damn nest." They began splashing the oil on the dry logs of her cabin, the home she had just defended with such passion. The acrid smell filled the air. Claire's mind screamed. This was it. This was the fire she had always feared. But this time, She was the one trapped. One of the men pulled a torch from his saddle, its flame a single, hungry point of light in the darkness. He touched it to the oil-soaked wall. The wood caught with a sudden, greedy whoosh. Flames erupted, licking up the side of the cabin, casting a terrifying, dancing light across the yard. The men stood back, watching their handiwork, their masked faces demonic in the firelight. Suddenly, a voice cut through the night, a roar of pure, primal fury. "Get away from her!" Jake burst from the tree line, a dark, avenging shape against the backdrop of the burning forest. He didn't have his gun. He must have left it in the cabin. He held only a heavy branch he must have ripped from a tree. He flew at the men with a terrifying speed. He brought the branch down on the back of the man holding the torch, who crumpled to the ground with a cry of pain. The other three turned on him at once. It was a desperate, brutal fight. Jake was a whirlwind of motion, blocking, striking, using the branch as a club, but he was outnumbered. One of the men drew a long hunting knife, its blade glinting in the firelight. As Jake fought off the large man, the one with the knife lunged, sinking the blade deep into Jake's side. Jake cried out, a sharp, ragged sound of agony. He staggered back, dropping the branch, his hand flying to the wound. The large man saw his chance and charged, driving his shoulder into Jake's chest, sending him crashing to the ground. They descended on him, kicking and stomping. Seeing him go down, a strength born of terror and love surged through Claire. She scrambled to her knees, frantically working at the ropes on her wrists. The fire was growing, the heat scorching her face. She had to get to him. The rope finally gave way. She scrambled to her feet and grabbed the axe from the chopping block. With a wild, incoherent scream, she ran at the men surrounding Jake. She swung the heavy axe with all her might. The men, startled by this new furious assault, fell back. They had come to burn a witch, not to be killed by one. The large man looked from Claire's crazed, axe-wielding form to the growing inferno of the cabin. "Let's go," he yelled. They scrambled for their horses and galloped away into the darkness, leaving chaos and destruction in their wake. Claire dropped the axe and fell to her knees beside Jake. He was conscious, but barely. His face was a bruised, bloody mask, and a dark, terrible stain was spreading across his shirt from the wound in his side. The cabin was now fully engulfed, a roaring pyre that lit the night sky, its flames casting a hellish glow on the scene. "Jake," she sobbed, cradling his head in her lap. "Oh, God, Jake!" He looked up at her, his gray eyes clouded with pain. He tried to speak, but only a bloody cough came out. He reached up, his hand trembling, and touched her cheek, his fingers leaving a smear of his own blood on her skin. Then his eyes rolled back, and he went limp in her arms. The fire roared, consuming her home, her past, everything she had fought to protect. But she didn't see it. All she saw was the man in her arms, his life bleeding out into the unforgiving dirt. She threw her head back and screamed, a long, raw cry of absolute despair that was lost in the crackle of the flames. The fire that consumed her home was a merciless, living thing. It roared and feasted on the dry timber, on the memories, on the very air of the life Claire had known. But as she knelt in the dirt, cradling Jake's unconscious form, the inferno became a distant, silent spectacle. Her world had shrunk to the space of her arms, to the man bleeding out within them. The heat on her skin was nothing compared to the icy dread that had seized her heart. Panic was a luxury she couldn't afford, as the flames began to die down, leaving the blackened skeleton of her cabin stark against the pre-dawn sky. A cold, desperate clarity took hold of her. He was alive. His breathing was shallow, a faint, ragged whisper. But it was there. That was all that mattered. With a strength she didn't know she possessed, she dragged him away from the smoldering ruins, away from the scene of the attack, and into the relative safety of the dense woods behind her property. She found a small, sheltered clearing, protected by a low-hanging rock ledge and thick pine trees. This would be their sanctuary. The days that followed blurred into a single, unending cycle of fear and care. She salvaged what she could from the still-standing barn: old horse blankets, a length of canvas, a small pot. She fashioned a crude lean-to against the rock face, a pathetic shelter against the cold nights. Her first priority was the wound. The hunting knife had gone in deep, just below his ribs. Using the last of her clean rags and boiled water from the nearby creek, she cleaned it as best she could. She had no stitches, no medicine, only the poultices of yarrow and plantain she could find in the woods. Remedies learned from a half-remembered childhood lesson. He did not wake. He was lost in a fevered, restless world of his own. For hours, he would lie terrifyingly still, his skin clammy and pale, his breathing so shallow she would press her ear to his chest to make sure he was still with her. Then the fever would take him, and he would thrash and mutter, his body burning with heat. He spoke names she didn't know: Elias, Cain, Maria, and fought battles against unseen enemies in the dark confines of their makeshift shelter. During these episodes, she would bathe his face with cool water, hold his hand, and murmur soothing, nonsensical words, trying to anchor him to the world of the living. She nursed him day and night, her own needs becoming secondary. She snared a single scrawny rabbit and made a thin broth, which she patiently spooned between his cracked lips, most of it dribbling back out. She foraged for edible roots and berries, her stomach a tight, aching knot of hunger and anxiety. Sleep came in short, fitful bursts, sitting up with her back against the cold rock, his hand in hers, starting awake at his every moan or shudder. She watched him waste away before her eyes. The hard muscle of his body softened. The sharp angles of his face became more pronounced. His skin stretched taut over his cheekbones. The wound in his side was not getting better. It was inflamed, angry, and oozing. The smell of infection faint but unmistakable. She knew, with a certainty that was a cold stone in her gut, that her simple remedies were not enough. He needed a doctor. He needed real medicine, a clean bed, a roof over his head. He was dying, slowly and inexorably, in her arms. The thought of Redemption Gulch filled her with a paralyzing terror. It was a nest of vipers, a place that had cast her out and tried to murder the man she loved. To return there was to walk willingly into the lion's den. They would likely finish the job they had started, or at the very least, turn their backs on her, leaving her to her fate. But then she would look at Jake's pale, still face, and a different, more powerful fear would consume her. The fear of what her life would be if he died. The silence, the emptiness, the return to a loneliness that would now be 1,000 times more profound. She had no money. The small stash of coins she kept hidden in a loose floorboard was now ash. Along with everything else, all she had of value were her mare, Jake's roan, her milk cow, and her few remaining chickens, all of which had survived the attack, huddled in the far end of their pasture. They were her last assets in the world. After a particularly bad night, when Jake's fever had spiked so high she thought she would lose him, she made her decision. The fear of losing him was greater than her fear of them, leaving him with a canteen of fresh water. She whispered a promise into his unhearing ear and set off for town on foot, a desperate, solitary figure walking back towards the source of her pain. The walk was surreal. The world was bright and alive with the sounds of spring, a cruel counterpoint to the darkness in her soul. When she reached the edge of town, she hesitated, her courage failing her. The place looked the same, dusty, quiet, deceptively peaceful. But for her, every doorway held a potential enemy, every window a pair of judging eyes. She forced her feet to move, walking down the main street, feeling as naked and vulnerable as a snail without its shell. People saw her. A few stopped dead in their tracks, their mouths agape. Others quickly ducked into doorways or turned their heads, refusing to meet her gaze. She saw no open hostility, but the shunning was absolute, a wall of silent condemnation. She went first to the office of the town's physician, a crotchety old man named Doc Stevens, but a sign on his door said he was away in the next county, delivering a baby. Despair, cold and sharp, began to creep in. She was standing in the alley beside the general store, her last hope fading, trying to figure out what to do next, when a voice called out to her, soft and reedy. "You, girl, in here." Claire looked up and saw the back door of a small, neat house ajar. A woman with a face like a dried apple, framed by wisps of snow-white hair, was beckoning to her. It was Martha Pritchard, a widow even older than the town itself, a woman who rarely left her home and was almost as much of an outcast as Claire. Hesitantly, Claire stepped into the small, dark kitchen. It smelled of lavender and wood smoke. Martha closed the door and peered at Claire with sharp, bird-like eyes. "You look like you've seen the devil himself," the old woman said, her voice raspy. "And from the looks of this town, I'd say you have—" "I need help," Claire whispered, her voice cracking. My friend, he's hurt badly. The men who burned my cabin, they stabbed him." Martha nodded slowly, her gaze surprisingly gentle. There was no judgment in her eyes, only a deep, ancient weariness. "I know," she said. "I heard the talk. The cowards." She gestured for Claire to sit at a small wooden table. "I know what it's like," she continued, her voice dropping lower. "To have the whole town turn on you. My husband, he wasn't a good man. When he passed, they all looked at me the same way they look at you. Like I was glad of it." A flicker of a bitter smile touched her lips. "I was, but that's a truth a woman isn't allowed to own. This town has a long memory for a woman's supposed sins and a short one for a man's." She saw herself in Claire, another woman branded and cast out by the town's harsh, hypocritical justice. She shuffled over to a small tin box on a shelf and took out a few worn bills and some coins. She pressed them into Claire's hand. "It's not much," she said, "but it's what I have. Don't you waste your time here. Doc Stevens is a fool who's more interested in whiskey than medicine. But his brother, Samuel, he's a real doctor, has a small clinic over in Harmony Creek. It's a day's ride, but he's a good man. He won't ask questions." She then pushed a small cloth bundle into Claire's other hand. "Clean bandages, and some laudanum for the pain. Go now, and don't you let this place break you." Claire looked at the money and the bandages, then at the old woman's wrinkled face, and felt a surge of gratitude so powerful it brought fresh tears to her eyes. "Why?" she asked. "Why are you helping me?" Martha patted her hand. "Because I know what it costs to stand alone," she said simply. "Now go!" Claire left through the back door, her heart a little lighter with the first glimmer of hope. Martha's kindness was a revelation. Not everyone in this town was evil. As if to prove the point, on her way out of town, she saw Thomas Miller, the blacksmith, standing outside his forge. Their eyes met for a brief second. He didn't speak, but he didn't sneer either. He just looked down at the ground, his face a mask of what looked like shame. He knew who had attacked her, and his silence had made him complicit. The town was not a monolith of hate. It was a collection of individuals, most of them just too frightened to stand up to the cruel few. Armed with a new resolve, Claire set her plan in motion. She went to the livery stable at the edge of town. Silas, the owner, was a taciturn man who cared more for horses than for people. She told him she was selling her livestock, all of it. He looked at her, his expression unreadable, then walked out to her property to inspect the animals. He was a fair man. He offered her a decent price for the 2 horses and the cow, a price that, combined with Martha's money, would be enough. As he was counting out the bills, he paused. "The chickens too?" he asked. Claire nodded, her throat tight. He added another small coin to the pile. "For your trouble," he mumbled, not meeting her eye. Her last ties to the land, to her old life, were now severed. She was adrift, her entire world now focused on the single task of saving Jake. She used a portion of the money to hire a buckboard wagon and a sturdy draft horse from Silas. The last piece of her plan was the hardest. She had to move Jake from their shelter in the woods to the wagon. He was a dead weight, his body limp and unresponsive. It was a slow, agonizing process, a half-mile journey of her dragging, pulling, and half-carrying him. By the time she got him settled into the back of the wagon on a bed of hay and old blankets, she was exhausted, her muscles screaming in protest. The journey to Harmony Creek was a special kind of hell. The road was little more than a deeply rutted track, and every jolt of the wagon sent a fresh wave of pain through Jake's body, making him groan and cry out in his delirium. Claire sat beside him, trying to cushion him from the worst of the bumps, constantly bathing his face and whispering to him, praying with every fiber of her being. He drifted in and out of consciousness, his eyes occasionally fluttering open, but they were unfocused, looking at something she couldn't see. His mutterings were incessant, a jumbled litany of his past. But then, in the middle of the long, arduous afternoon, his voice became suddenly clear. Though faint, he was not thrashing. He was still, his eyes closed. "Claire," he whispered, his voice a dry rasp. Her heart leaped. She leaned down, her ear close to his lips. "I'm here, Jake, I'm right here." He seemed to struggle to form the words, his brow furrowed in concentration. "The fire," he murmured. Don't let them put out the light, in you." The words struck her with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't about the cabin. It was about her. For years, she had been letting them do just that. She had allowed the town's judgment, Elias's cruelty, and her own fear to extinguish the person she might have been. She had been living in the dark, a shadow of herself. Jake, a man who had lived his entire life in the shadows, was pleading with her not to join him there. He saw a light in her worth protecting, a light she hadn't even realized was still there. In that moment, everything shifted. Her love for him was not a mistake, a shameful secret, or the cause of her ruin. It was the truest, most real thing she had ever felt. It was the flame that had been rekindled inside her. It was not a weakness. It was her only strength. It was her salvation. He had saved her from the storm, and she had saved him from his wound. But together, they were saving each other from the crushing darkness of their own solitude. She looked at his pale, suffering face, and a fierce, unwavering certainty settled in her soul, as solid and real as the mountains around them. The town could condemn her. The world could turn its back. It no longer mattered. Her place was with him. She squeezed his hand, her resolve hardening into a silent, unbreakable vow. "I won't," she whispered to him, though he had already slipped back into delirium. "I promise." She would get him to the doctor. She would see him healed, and if he woke up, if he survived this ordeal, she would marry him. She would build a new life with him, not on the ashes of her past, but on the foundation of this fierce, defiant love. It was the only hope she had left in the world, and she would cling to it with everything she had. Harmony Creek was not a town so much as a hopeful cluster of buildings nestled in a green, well-watered valley that seemed a world away from the harsh, red-dust landscape of Redemption Gulch. Its air was cleaner, its people quieter. Here, in a small, whitewashed clinic run by a gentle, silver-haired man named Dr. Samuel Stevens, Jake began the long, slow climb back to the world of the living. For the first few days, he was a ghost, hovering in the gray twilight between life and death. The doctor, a man with kind eyes and hands that were surprisingly steady for their age, cleaned and stitched the wound, his face grim. The blade was dirty, he told Claire, his voice low. "The infection is deep. We've done all we can. Now it's up to him and the good Lord." Claire refused to leave his side. She sold the buckboard and horse for a fraction of what she'd paid. using the money to rent a tiny room above the town's bakery. It smelled perpetually of yeast and cinnamon, a scent so wholesome and normal it felt like a dream. But she spent little time there. Most of her hours were spent in a wooden chair by Jake's bedside in the clinic. She held his hand, bathed his feverish brow, and spoke to him in a low, constant murmur, telling him about the green valley, about the sound of the creek, about the future she was stubbornly determined they would have. She was a lifeline, a constant, unwavering presence in his fevered darkness. The fever broke on the 5th day. Claire was dozing in her chair, her head slumped against the wall, when a faint, raspy voice pulled her from the depths of her exhaustion. Water. Her eyes flew open. Jake was looking at her. His eyes were no longer clouded with delirium, but were clear, lucid, and achingly familiar. They were sunken in his pale, gaunt face. But they were his eyes. A sob of pure, unadulterated relief escaped her lips. She fumbled with the pitcher and glass, her hands shaking so badly she could barely pour. She held the glass to his lips, and he drank, his throat working with a painful effort. His recovery was a slow, arduous process. He had lost a great deal of blood, and the infection had ravaged his body, leaving him weak as a newborn kitten. For the first week, he could do little more than sleep and sip the thin broth Claire spooned into his mouth. But with each passing day, a little more strength returned. The color began to creep back into his face. He could sit up, propped by pillows, his voice growing stronger than a whisper. As his physical strength returned, however, a deep brooding melancholy seemed to settle over him. He would lie for hours, staring at the ceiling, the silence in the room heavy with the things he wouldn't say. He rarely spoke of the attack, but Claire could see it playing over and over in his mind. She saw the guilt in the way he looked at his own hands, the shame in the way he avoided her gaze. He was haunted by the destruction he had brought down upon her. One afternoon, when he was strong enough to sit in the chair by the window, he finally spoke the words that had been poisoning the air between them. "You should have left me there," he said, his voice flat, his gaze fixed on the street outside. Claire stopped her mending, the needle poised in midair. "Don't be a fool, Jake." "I'm not," he said, turning to look at her. His gray eyes filled with a profound, weary sadness. "Look what I've done to you. Your home is gone. Your name is mud in that town. Everything you had, everything you fought for, it's all ash because of me." He took a ragged breath. "When I'm strong enough to ride, I'll go. I'll head west, to the territories. No one will find me. You can go back. You can tell them I forced you, that I'm gone for good. Maybe in time, they'll leave you be." He was offering her an escape. He was trying to cut himself out of her life like a surgeon removing a diseased limb, believing it was the only way to save her. He was willing to walk back into the lonely wilderness that had been his only home, to sacrifice his own happiness for the sake of hers. The nobility of it, the sheer, heartbreaking selflessness of his offer, broke her heart. She stood up and walked over to him, kneeling on the floor in front of his chair. She took his larger, scarred hands in her own. They were thinner now, but they still felt like home. "Jake, look at me," she commanded, her voice soft but unyielding. He reluctantly met her gaze. "Before you came, I wasn't living, I was surviving. I had a house, but it wasn't a home. It was a prison I built to hide from a world I was terrified of. I had a piece of land, but my life was barren. You talk about what I've lost? That fire took nothing from me that I hadn't already lost years ago." Tears welled in her eyes, but her voice remained strong. "You didn't bring me trouble, Jake. You brought me to life. You were the first person to see me, Claire, not the widow, not the outcast. You taught me how to fight back, not with fists, but by choosing to love instead of to hate." She squeezed his hands, her gaze fierce and unwavering. "So you listen to me. I am not going back there. My home is not a pile of ashes in Redemption Gulch. My home is with you. I don't need that town's forgiveness. I don't need their acceptance or their respect. The only thing in this world that I need is for you to stay." His own eyes glistened with unshed tears. The deep, painful knot of guilt and self-loathing inside him finally began to dissolve in the face of her fierce, unconditional love. He had spent his entire life believing he was a poison, a blight on anyone who got too close. And here was this woman, who had seen the very worst of him, of the world he came from, telling him that he was not a curse, but a blessing. He leaned forward, resting his forehead against hers, and for the first time since the attack, he let himself truly believe that they might have a future. Their wedding took place a month later, on a warm day in early summer. There was no church, no preacher from a town that would have condemned them. The ceremony was held in a small, sun-dappled meadow just outside Harmony Creek, officiated by Dr. Stevens, who, it turned out, was also a justice of the peace. The only witnesses were the doctor's kind, matronly wife, and, to Claire's utter astonishment, Martha Pritchard. The old woman had made the 2-day journey in a hired buggy, sitting ramrod straight in her best black dress, her presence a silent, powerful testament of solidarity. Claire wore a simple dress of pale blue cotton, a gift from Mrs. Stevens. She had woven a chain of wildflowers, bluebells, and wild daisies into her hair. She looked not like a grieving widow, but like a young woman on the cusp of a new life. Jake stood beside her, looking thin and still a little frail in a borrowed shirt, but his shoulders were straight, and his eyes, when they looked at Claire, held an expression of such profound adoration that it made the doctor's wife dab at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. They exchanged simple vows, their voices quiet but firm in the peaceful meadow. They had no rings to give, so instead, they exchanged promises. He promised to honor and protect her, to be the man she deserved. She promised to stand by him, to be his harbor and his home. When the doctor pronounced them man and wife, Jake leaned down and kissed her, a tender, reverent kiss filled with the promise of a quiet, peaceful future. It was the most beautiful ceremony Claire could have ever imagined. They didn't go back to Redemption Gulch. The ashes of the old cabin held nothing for them but ghosts. Instead, they took the last of their money and bought a small plot of land a few miles away from Harmony Creek, a place that held only good memories. It was the place he had first taken her, the hidden, beautiful spot by the creek that tumbled down from the mountains. It was remote, secluded, and to them, it was paradise. They began to build their new life, literally from the ground up. They lived in a tent for the first few weeks, and with the help of Dr. Stevens and a few friendly farmers from the area, they held a barn raising for their new home. It was a small, sturdy cabin, built from pine logs they felled themselves. Jake, though not yet at his full strength, was a skilled woodsman. He notched the logs with a craftsman's precision, his hands, which had once been instruments of violence, now being used to create, to build, to shelter. Claire worked alongside him, chinking the logs with mud and moss, her hands growing calloused, her face browned by the sun. Every log they placed, every nail they hammered, was an act of hope, a defiant statement that they would not be broken. Slowly, their house became a home. It was smaller than her old cabin, but it was filled with light and warmth. The door, which Jake had painstakingly crafted, opened onto a view of the creek and the rolling, wildflower-strewn hills. There was no need for heavy bars or latches here. A year passed, a year of quiet, healing peace. The seasons turned, and with them, the last of the shadows in their hearts receded. The harsh memories of the fire and the attack began to fade, replaced by the simple, profound joys of their shared life. Claire was pregnant, her belly swelling with the promise of a new generation, a child who would be born not into a world of judgment and fear, an heir to their resilience and their love. Jake found a new purpose. He discovered a latent talent for woodworking, and his hands, which had once been so quick with a gun, were now even quicker with a chisel and saw. He began to make simple, beautiful furniture, sturdy chairs, smooth-topped tables, and intricately carved chests. He sold his pieces in Harmony Creek, and his reputation as a fine craftsman began to grow. The man who had once been known as a killer was now known as a creator. The weight of his past had finally been lifted. Their story, as stories do, traveled on the wind. It drifted back to Redemption Gulch and beyond. But the narrative had changed. They were no longer the scandalous pairing of the witch and the gunslinger. A different legend began to take shape around them, a quieter, more hopeful one. They became known to weary travelers and other outcasts as the couple who were burned but not broken. Occasionally, a stranger would find their way to the small cabin by the creek, a prospector down on his luck, a young family heading west with a broken wagon wheel, a woman fleeing a life as hard as Claire's had been. They would arrive, hesitant and wary, and find not judgment, but a quiet welcome. Claire would offer them a hot meal, and Jake would help mend what was broken, be it a wheel or a weary spirit. They never preached or offered grand advice. They simply offered a moment of peace, a brief respite from a harsh world, a silent testament to the fact that it was possible to survive the fire and build again. The story ends here, on a late afternoon in their second summer. The sun is low in the sky, casting a long golden light across the valley. The air is warm and smells of pine and the damp earth by the creek. Jake is on the small porch, sanding a piece of light-colored wood, the rhythmic scrape of the paper a soothing, peaceful sound. Claire sits in a rocking chair he made for her, her hands resting on her round belly, watching him with a soft, contented smile. The door to their cabin, their sanctuary, stands wide open, a gentle breeze rustling the curtains in the window. There are no more warnings to be given, no more threats to keep at bay. Their world is safe, their hearts are full, and no one, ever again, needs to be told. Please don't come inside. Thank you for listening to our story around the campfire tonight. We'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from, so please drop a comment below and let's all connect. If you enjoyed our tale, we'd be much obliged if you'd subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts. Until next time, keep your fires bright.